What do we learn about God from Whitehead?
Hmm. Yeah, it's a hard question because this term God has such a it's polysemic, and what do we learn about God? In Whitehead, well, he has a concept of God. He's a metaphysician, and he's trying to draw on the history of religious experience in order to um, justify the use of the term God in his metaphysical scheme. And there's a function that this concept, this divine function, has uh, in Whitehead's scheme, and I'll talk about that. But I think it's important just to say at the outset that as a symbol, uh, God is how we attempt to bring into culture something that we that many people across all of human history have experienced. And actually, some people prefer not even to use that symbol, God, but I think are still referring to the same experience. Maybe they call it a Tao, or any number of other names that we could use for this. But I think that mystical experience is is at the core and remains ineffable. And we have various ways of trying to bring it into our cultural lives and ritualizing it. And as philosophers, we have various ways of trying to understand it. Um, so the function of God in Whitehead's universe is to is twofold, really. To first, cosmologically speaking, to provide uh, relevant value and a sense of ordering of possibilities. Physicists nowadays will talk about fine tuning of the fundamental constants and the laws of physics and stuff. That's kind of what this first function of God is for Whitehead. He calls it the primordial nature of God. Order possibility such that something determinate could actualize. And that's a cosmological problem that he tries to solve with this divine function. The other aspect of God in Whitehead's scheme is sort of more anthropological, I would say, in the sense that it's an answer to our need, psychospiritual need, you could say, for some sense that history is not um, just one damn thing after the other, but it's an unfolding, a purposeful unfolding, and that whatever is realized that has value is somehow preserved, if not physically preserved, then at least spiritually preserved in this divine memory, right? And so this is the consequent nature of God for Whitehead, and it's something like the soul of the world, and it grows with time to encompass and harmonize everything which has happened in the course of history, right? So the primordial nature is sort of eternal and setting um, the structure of possibility for the actual universe to unfold within, not determining how that universe unfolds, but giving it a sense of what would be best, giving it a sense of an ideal, capital V value. And then the consequent nature is receiving everything that happens, suffering with the universe, Whitehead would say, um, and growing with that universe. And so, in that sense, the consequent nature is more in time. The primordial nature is more out of time. Um, that's how he thinks about God.
That first part of the primordial one, before time setting the constant say of the universe, like why does anything exist? How do we get something rather than nothing? That sounds more consonant with just general views of God as ultimate ground of being that I'm more familiar with. But then that latter one, you said that within time, though, the memory of all that's happened and all that's been. I would love to hear more about that. Tell me more about how God is sort of infused in time and shaped by, in fact, all that's gone before that.
Mm. Well, the important thing I should say first is that this is supposed to be one God, two aspects, two poles, primordial and consequent poles of God. But before I get into the consequent nature more, this God that grows with time, I just want to say I don't think actually the primordial nature is all that orthodox. This isn't a creator God. Whitehead says God is a creature of creativity. So for him, it's this impersonal creativity that is ultimate, and God is the first condition that creativity places upon itself, we have to say. But he also says that God is a creature of creativity. And so, in some sense, this is very heterodox and unorthodox to call God a creature. The existence of God, Whitehead says, is contingent, not necessary. So God is not simply necessary existence, but from the perspective of creativity, God's existence is contingent because everything is. But from our perspective as creatures, God's existence is necessary. So God becomes necessary existence after the fact, so to speak. It's a subtle shift in the ontological, arrangement. Say Saint Anselm's argument for the existence of God was just God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. God is necessary existence. God's essence is to exist, and so on. Whitehead's inverting that a lot. I mean, inverting it precisely. And so it's a different picture of the divine as in some sense needing the universe to exist rather than us it just being a one-way relationship where the universe exists by the grace of God, the universe being created from nothing by God. This is not a creator God for Whitehead. This is a relator God, I would say.
Can I
Yeah.
jump in and just ask, when God is contingent and maybe actually needs the universe and comes into it from something, or it it sounds like creativity, or there's something beyond God, but then is that not God? Or tell me a bit more about what could exist before God.
I mean, we could think of this as, in a Trinitarian way, creativity is the Father, which is this sort of unmanifest, mysterious ground of being, and the primordial nature is the logos, or the expressive, the Son, the manifest form of the divine, and the consequent nature is the Spirit, that which hovers between and is never the same twice, and yet is continuous with it, with what has come before, and allows for a kind of atonement, and is its life, and so I think, and Whitehead is explicit about his indebtedness to the doctrine of the Trinity, the symbol of the Trinity, and so I think we can apply this, with his blessing, to understand more what he means with these concepts. Um, so, so yeah, creativity and the primordial and consequent natures of God are his way of rendering this Trinitarian relationship, but it's relationship that's primary for him, and so, um, rather than
Yeah,
thinking of God and the world as separate, these are mutually, reciprocally, creating poles of the same process.
I'm just trying to understand why he'd so he keeps the Trinity, he really likes it, but then also he wants to innovate on it. And um, so tell me more about a relational view of the Trinity and of reality.
Yeah.
What is he doing there?
Well, the good news is it's very Christian. I mean, the good news is that he wants the image of Jesus to be the operative image of God, not Caesar, not Pharaoh, not some kind of imperial ruler. He thinks that that's an idolatrous image of God, and unfortunately, it more or less has come to dominate after Rome absorbed Christianity. As he puts it, in Process and Reality, Caesar's lawyers edited, uh, the Bible, and we ended up with a religion that celebrates imperialism often, rather than one that actually follows and embodies the teachings of Jesus. And this image of the divine as incarnate and as suffering with the world, for the world. Um, and so it's not really that unorthodox. It's just, I think, applying, um, a less idolatrous, image of the divine, and working out the conceptual consequences of that, so that God is no longer all powerful in the sense of, uh, being coercive and forcing the world to do this or that, but rather persuasive and loving.
Do you think one could think of it as God does and could have the power to do anything, but doesn't use it, or is it not possible. Maybe there's a problem with my question here, but
No, I think in Whitehead's view, God can't. It's a limited God. This is a creaturely God. This is a God subject to the same metaphysical rules as every other creature. Not an exception to those rules, but the chief exemplification of the rules that apply to the rest of us.
I've heard of Whitehead being called a heretic philosopher, and in a way, in some ways, if you say that God is limited, I could see why. But also, as you say, maybe it also makes Christianity more Christian than it's sometimes seen, because God is really inherently tied and wrapped up in the world. So you can't just, yeah, like that. Would you say there's almost something about creation and nature that it influences God? So God is then mutable and yeah,
Yeah, it's a two-way. It's not God is not an unmoved mover, but the most moved mover. God feels everything in Whitehead's theology, which again I think is just a consequence of the teaching, the doctrine of incarnation. And so, is he a heretic? He's a threat to a certain kind of theological establishment. Yeah. But I also think, when St. Thomas Aquinas first, published the Summa, it was on the index, it was banned, it was like, and then he's sainted later. So we could be talking about Saint Whitehead in 50 or 100 years. Yeah.
beautiful. I want to think then, okay, because when you conceive of God as being in part wrapped up in creation, then creation matters for God as well. We need to think about both of them. And so then I'm wondering, uh, does reality and nature have a direction? Like, is there purpose to God, to humans? How should we think about meaning, but not just in like a moral sense, like, but although not that, but just even just where does the universe go? What is its purpose?
Well, Whitehead says the teleology of the universe is directed at the production of beauty. And so the purpose is aesthetic. And Whitehead says that God seeks intensity of experience. And intensity of experience, or intensity of beauty, beautiful experience, is defined as maximizing the amount of contrast that can be held in harmony. Right. And so there's this drive to diversify, but to unify at the same time. And, Whitehead says that the whole universe is lured by beauty as its end, and that there's a kind of cosmic reason, or logos, we could say, that is both driving ever more intricate differentiation, but at the same time finding a way to bring that all of that differentiation into richer and richer harmonization, right? And so, what is the good in that type of a universe? Well, it's a good that's going to be beyond relative good and evil, because the thing is, if this is the basic purpose and end of the universe, the production of beauty, sometimes discord is important to shake up established habits and repetitive rhythms, but locally, when something creative is expressed, the local community, the local society may feel really disturbed by it and say that's evil. But in the larger scheme of things, that seemingly discordant note is kind of the cue that sets off the unfolding of an even more beautiful harmonization, right? And so I think it's important, when we think about Whitehead's theology, to not come rushing in with Nietzsche's hammer and say, oh, this is just the same old, monotheism or whatever. It's not. Whitehead is beyond good and evil in his morality, and actually read Nietzsche and was very much willing to affirm this kind of will to power metaphysics. But for Whitehead, power doesn't just mean the power to affect something else or to cause something. It's also the power to be affected by, right? Power, potency, and the dunamis in the Greek is, it's two ways. It's not simply active; it's active and passive. It's sort of the in between. Um, and so, power in that sense is, Whitehead says that the essence of power is composition, right? It's it's this aesthetic vision, right? And so it's very consonant with Nietzsche, but it's still teleological. But I think it's teleological in a way that is post Nietzschean, let's say.
Hmm.
Yeah.
When you bring up how for beauty to unfold in reality, sometimes discord and change needs to come, and that is a part of reality. It makes me think of Rudolf Steiner and the way he, believe it's his innovation, but just Jung also talks about it, that evil is part of God or the universe. At least it's not like the absence of good. Evil exists. We shouldn't disown it. And so I'm interested in then what you'd say about God and the problem of evil, given this.
Hmm. Yeah. So I think in an evolutionary cosmology, and Whitehead and Steiner, they're both articulating um, a vision of the universe that's, yeah, evolutionary, and God that's evolutionary. And I think um, in that context, we have to say something about evil, because very clearly death is one of the most potent engines of evolution. Um, the process of natural selection. Whitehead says this stares us in our face. It's obvious that this occurs. It's not the only thing that Whitehead thinks is driving evolution, or that Steiner thinks is driving evolution, but it's there. And so, where does death come from? Where does malice come from? Why is there hatred in the world? And the simple answer would be that we need to meet spirit needs to meet resistance in order to learn and grow and deepen. And so, if the universe is aimed at the production of beauty, then in some sense it's a school for love. Like, we're learning how to love despite the fact that there is strife and malice and suffering and death in the world. That's why spirit is engaged in this process of evolution. That's why human beings have to die. And lots of esoteric Christians, Steiner, J.R.R. Tolkien, others would say, the angels uh, are really curious about what it's like to be a human being, because we know something they don't know, and that is we die. Like, we experience life as something precious because we die. We're incarnate. And as incarnate beings, we encounter evil. I mean, the angels encounter a different kind of evil too, I suppose. Don't want to rule that out. But I think, what Steiner is, and Whitehead in his way are inviting us to consider, is that evil isn't something that might be eliminated. It's not something that even God might eliminate. Um, it's rather a necessary byproduct of an evolutionary universe. And so, Whitehead would say we have to, uh, just as Jesus said again, right, love thy enemies. Um, and Steiner has a view of evil as, actually, it's not just Satan. It's not just localized in like one being. It's actually an opposition between these two extremes. You could say a materialistic extreme and a spiritual extreme. He calls the materialist extreme Ahriman, which comes out of Zoroastrianism. Um, Ahriman is just the cold technological intellect that wants to reduce everything to what's most efficient, and there is no deeper meaning. It's just pleasure and hedonism and so on. And then the other being he calls Lucifer, which is this being that's overly escapist and elitist and too idealistic, and so disembodied and removed from everyday experience and embodied life and so on. And for Steiner, it's Christ that holds the center, and that prevents us from flying off into either extreme and allows us to be here on the earth between heaven and hell, as it were. And that's where we're supposed to be. We shouldn't take flight to heaven or bury ourselves into the material world. We should hold the middle. That would be the Christic impulse in Steiner's view. And I think, in Whitehead, that's sort of what the primordial and consequent natures of God are, for Whitehead, a different kind of polarity. That's like the polarity of good, you might say. Whereas Steiner has the polarity of evil, Whitehead has this polarity of good. So they're addressing this challenge from different angles, perhaps, but I think in a complementary way.
I like that. In Christianity, sometimes Satan, it's vague what it is, and so it's interesting to separate it out into two and think about the different elements. And you just brought it in there as well. God as well has two different elements. Maybe tell me a bit more about why Whitehead then does that. Why these two different poles?
I think traditionally philosophers have always talked about time and eternity, and it seems that in the Christian tradition, but also in Buddhism, there's these three bodies or kayas: the Dharmakaya, Nirmanakaya, Sambodhakaya, and a sense that Buddha is both, in some sense, atemporal and transcendent, but also fully immanent and embodied, and something in between. With those three bodies. And similarly in Christianity, it's like you have, as we talked about earlier, the Trinity, but there's a sense in which the divine is fully transcendent and eternal and infinite, but another sense in which God became a human being, flesh and blood, was tortured, hung on a cross, and died. So God became very particular and unique and situated as in a human form. And so how do you hold those two together? Whitehead wanted to do justice to both of those aspects of the divine, and the primordial and the consequent nature were his way of doing that. And the thing is, when we talk about Whitehead's God, this isn't a God that's up there somewhere. The primordial nature of God lives in what Whitehead calls the initial aim that is present in every moment of our experience. So God lives in us, in our experience. Whitehead doesn't think of God as an idea. God is a fact that is so fundamental and basic to our experience that we very easily neglect it. Whitehead says metaphysics is the analysis of the obvious, and rather than thinking of the divine, this primordial fact, as something far off and away, and like you only access it in these special mystical experiences if you're lucky, he's like, well, yeah, we become conscious of it in those special experiences, but actually, what we become conscious of is that it's always been staring us right in the face the whole time, right? So God's not hidden somewhere else out there for Whitehead. It's like it's happening right here and right now. In each moment, it's what allows us to even have a coherent thought and to relate what's happened now to what's happened in the past, but also to everything that remains possible in the future. We're constantly performing this infinite, I could say calculation, but it's not actually a calculation. It's beyond computation. It's not a Bayesian inference mechanism. It's a deeper form of intuition. And Whitehead goes into specifically the difference between a sort of statistical rendering where, somehow a Bayesian brain would be orienting us in time in this way. Whitehead doesn't think that's actually possible, or that statistical reasoning presupposes a ground of order, which Whitehead just bites the bullet and says, okay, well, that's divine. And that we have an intuition of that directly that doesn't need to be constantly calculated. But anyways, that's part of the picture of, the divine being. This is a panentheist vision, so the divine is in the world and the world is in God. And we're not imagining anymore a God that is separate from the world or from our experience.
I think to better understand God here, maybe we could get into Whitehead's process theology and philosophy and how he thinks about reality working. It's like you were mentioning our own human experience, and are we disconnected from reality? Do we need to perform Bayesian updating and reasoning to understand it? And kind of gets into modern cognitive science, biology, how how all this works, and
Mm-hmm.
we have many presuppositions in a modern day philosophically, scientifically about how this works, and some of it goes unquestioned, and then it warps our nature of what we think of reality and God as well. So tell me more about those kind of radical rethinking of what metaphysically reality is.
Mm. Yeah. Let's approach it this way. Whitehead says that his metaphysics is presenting a cell theory of actuality. And I interpret him to mean there that reality, the universe, grows kind of like a developing embryo, which means it starts as a whole, and then the parts are actually differentiations from that whole. Usually we think of parts as adding up to a whole. That's the more materialist, kind of reductionist orientation. Everything begins in a bunch of parts that then somehow arrange themselves and assemble into something more complicated. Whitehead, in taking a more organic approach, says that actually reality begins as a whole, like a fertilized egg, like a zygote, and it differentiates from that whole, right, through a process of division, cell division. And so when you get billions of years into this evolutionary process, let's say here we are on Earth, um, biological cells emerged out of this chemical process of cycling and rhythms, and we can go more into the what the origin of life looks like in Whitehead's Cosmos. But for Whitehead, ultimate, there's no ontological gap between physics and chemistry and biology in Whitehead. It's all a continuous creative unfolding. But once you get to, say, multicellular animals, primates like us, who come up with these models for how cognition works, we're capable of such high degrees of abstraction now as language using animals that we can get ourselves into a situation where we think we need to kind of add our own minds and consciousness back to a universe uh, that we imagine ourselves to somehow have been parachuted into from another dimension. It's like, no, actually, we grew out of this universe, and our cognition doesn't need to reconstruct an internal picture of it in order for us to be in direct contact with it. We are an expression of it. Um, we are cells in a larger, organism, and I think this vision, Whitehead's cosmology, lends itself to a totally different approach to cognitive science, right? I think it would be more like what's often called the inactivist and embodied and embedded, extended, the 4EA paradigm, so called. But there are also some issues with that because the inactivists don't often want to do speculative metaphysics and get into the cosmological implications. They end up pulling up short and leaving us with another kind of biological idealism, I think, because we end up saying whether we're inactivists or we're Bayesian brain, predictive processing, computationalist people, there's a kind of um, solipsism that we end up with where we're just limited to what our organism constructs for us in terms of the sense making that an organism does for an activist, or the Bayesian inference generating that and updating that a predictive processing model would describe it as. And I think Whitehead allows us to go deeper than that to see biological cognition is an example of experience that goes all the way down. And so even atoms are sense makers. Stars and galaxies are species of organism that are interpreting experience in very different ways at very different spatiotemporal scales. But nonetheless, it's biological life is not somehow special. It's an extreme example of something fundamental. Yeah.
So for Whitehead, organism and mind are kind of there at the start, and so when we evolve on this planet, humans, we're not come out of nowhere. We actually kind of come from a ground, a universe that already can support us. And one distinct thing you said is how we're already connected to everything else. And so, you could have modern cognitive science models of embodied cognition, like we make do sense making through our hands and our bodies and technology. But then you're maybe going further. Whitehead goes further by saying already we were never disconnected from that in the first place, and um,
Yeah.
and so then um, go on.
We kind of get this, I think, in like the free energy principle and the way that one can invert how one describes the implication of that model, where you can say that the organism is building a model of the environment, to minimize free energy. Um, but you could also say the environment is building a model of itself, and that's what the organism is. Um, the formalism works just as well in either direction. What's predicting what, you know? Um, and so that, I think that symmetry is something like what Whitehead is suggesting here. We need to think more environmentally about the nature of um, that, the nature of the boundary between order and chaos, and not think that, it's kind of odd to be materialist and to think that somehow inside of these uh, bags of skin, that matter chemistry could produce consciousness through some kind of chemical reaction. I don't know how materialists or emergentists imagine that happens exactly. Um, but if you back up again and just begin from the idea that the universe is more like a developing embryo than a chamber of gas molecules, because we need to work with basic images, whether we're materialists or not. And rather than thinking of the universe as somehow a big box with particles in it, I think it makes more sense. It's actually more naturalistic to see the universe as a developing embryo, because I mean that's what we are. Why wouldn't the universe be like that?
When you think of the universe as intrinsically already alive, however, I'm still struggling. I'm interested in understanding more. Say, we look at atoms or we look at planets and we think, oh, they're not alive. They're just, matter and like clumps of electrons and protons, or just, balls of fire or whatever. Um, are they, yeah, are they experiential? Are they conscious? And are they sophisticated? Like, actually, they're not that simple, these things. Like, how should we think about these, like what we think of as non-living entities?
I think we just need to look more closely and consider the different spatiotemporal scales. I mean, if you look at a house plant, just doesn't seem to be doing much. But if you use time lapse photography, you can see how through the course of several days, these rhythmic cycles, that plant is breathing, it's moving around, it's clearly sensing light, and it's animate. It's just that as animals, we move a little bit faster or a lot faster, and so we don't notice and appreciate the ways in which there are clear signs of life in plants. I think similarly, if you just observe the sun, um, and not just with our bare, naked eyes, but with the instrumentation that NASA and other space agencies have, you can see how this is a very complex electromagnetic phenomenon. The sun is not gas; it's plasma. It's this fourth state of matter that's very important to recognize, because 99% of the visible universe is actually plasma. 96% of the rest of the universe is supposedly dark matter or dark energy, but I think that's a absurd cosmological, mathematical artifact of a failed cosmology, in my opinion. If 96% of the universe is this very exotic stuff that can't be measured except by how it's the measure of the failure of our own equations, is what it is. But plasma cosmologist, which an interesting field of study I've been getting more into because it's very process relational and very much a kind of Whiteheadian vision of things. They're pointing out that, stars are self-organizing plasma events, and galaxies similarly are organized by plasma dynamics and electromagnetic fields that span millions of light years. And so when you look at a star, or let's just say a planet, um, Jupiter has a gigantic electromagnetic field around it that's quite dynamic and in constant interaction with the sun's electromagnetic field. And in terms of models of how the brain operates, I think some of these electromagnetic theories um, of consciousness as more of a field phenomenon are probably likely to be more promising. And so looking at stars and planets that have very complicated electromagnetic fields might indeed, for a future neuroscience more hip to this perspective, end up being a pretty good sign that, oh, actually, maybe these things are alive. Maybe they do have some kind of experiential horizon. Um, so this might sound very speculative, but I think it's grounded um, in the physics and in our understanding of uh, the organizational patterns that are present in the universe all around us. There's once you're relieved of the strange attachment to the idea that the brain might somehow secrete consciousness like the bile secretes liver, and you see that instead consciousness or sentience or experience is not the sort of thing that can just be squeezed out of matter, no matter how you arrange it or what shapes you put it into, then I think you can more easily consider, you know, astrophysical phenomena as possessing some kind of a mind.
Right, and it makes me think of Michael Evans' work on trying to look for diverse minds and what intelligence and cognition could look like, because we don't understand what they are too well. But he's done awesome work on gene regulatory networks and them being able to solve problems and at least overcome obstacles, and that can be a kind of cognition, right? And but it's really interesting when you talk about, say, planets having complex electromagnetic fields and plasma being very prominent in the universe, how like it just makes me think that maybe to hold their form, planets, galaxies, atoms, or many things are not actually doing nothing, but actually, we just take it for granted, because maybe we're not used to looking at the sun. We probably shouldn't look at just directly at the sun, but and so we're not observing it much. Like we're not observing our planet, we're not observing atoms or the sun. We can't, but um, if we do, maybe there is like problem solving. Maybe in a free energy principle sense to kind of hold that, and that's not dumb.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's very interesting. I I wanted to then ask though, when we have this view of experience in all of nature, um, I wonder what is new about humans.
Mm.
Like then reconceptualizing and rethinking about our higher order cognitive faculties, reflective consciousness. We think about it often. What new grows out of the universe with us?
Mm. Yeah, that's a very good question. Hmm. Well, for Whitehead, consciousness is actually somewhat peripheral and derivative. It's very important to distinguish experience from consciousness in Whitehead's cosmology. Um, Sometimes we equate the two, but he thinks most experience is actually not conscious. Even our human experience, most of the time, is not conscious. I mean, we're in a vegetative state for at least a third of the day when we're asleep. And when we're awake, quote unquote, we're in various degrees of daydreaming and not being fully present and conscious to what's happening in front of us. In fact, think about driving. I find if I'm too aware of every little detail that's happening, I'm a very unsafe driver. It's much better to be engaged in a light conversation with somebody and just sort of cruising along. And so most of what we do is, yeah, we're experiencing the world, but consciousness is something specific for Whitehead that has to do with the focused attention, not just on what is factually occurring, but on what could be occurring but isn't. Right. And so Whitehead says consciousness is the feeling of negation. Yeah, it's most experience is feeling and responding to what is, but conscious experience is feeling and responding to what is not, to the halo of possibilities around what's actually perceived, and the contrast between the facts perceived and the ideal could be's, maybes, right? Should be's. That's what consciousness dwells on. And so when we ask what's unique about the human being, what's unique about human consciousness, I think it has something to do with living in between ideal and actual, living in that, and it's a kind of torturous place to be. It's what turns pain into suffering. You know, that distinction that's often made between how, of course, animals can feel pain, but they don't reflect on the fact that they're feeling pain and wish they weren't feeling pain and compare it to all the times that they were happy. And, you know, we ramify and intensify animal pain by making it existential. But we also, because of this conscious reflective capacity, can alter our habits. We have a kind of freedom as a result of this. We can't sprout wings and fly suddenly, but we can train ourselves. We can exercise and deliberately undo our inheritance to pursue something different. And it doesn't seem to me that many other creatures, I mean, human beings can train other animals to do remarkable things. We used to think we were the only tool users. We used to think we were the only ones that could learn a language. No, we can teach animals to do a lot of that, primates and parrots and whatnot. But we're teaching them to do that. And this capacity for learning, not just learning, but pursuing ever greater forms of freedom. You know, we seem to be capable of liberating ourselves from instinct in a way that's not present in the rest of the animal kingdom. You know, so it's a difference in degree, probably not a difference in kind, but it's a difference that makes all the difference.
No, right. In pointing to humans and their unique place in the cosmos, right, we can access conscious ideas, or rather, ideas are always there, and consciousness, as you're saying, is actually negating what is actually there and going, hey, I can search out this or that possibility. I could do this or that. The world could be this or that other way. Um, and then when you relate that to the animals, okay, what are they capable of in contrast to us? It makes me think about in Genesis the way humans name the animals, and so we control and we subdue them. But then, as you say as well, like it just makes me think of the responsibility that humans have in the cosmos to help raise up other animals and other parts of the cosmos. Like now that we're here, but we're not thrown into it. We're part of the cosmos as well. And so, yeah, like kind of responsibility for the creation, the creative process of it, because we are kind of the apotheosis of that creative arc, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, to go back to Nietzsche, when he says God is dead, he says after that, we must become worthy of this deed. And the only way we could become worthy of killing God is by becoming gods. And so you speak to the importance of the responsibility of being human. We're co-creators. And that might initially sound hubristic or sacrilegious, like, oh, a lot of Christians, a lot of theists, Jews, Muslims would say that there's nothing more heretical than claiming to be divine. But that's what Jesus did and said, is it not written, all of you are also sons and daughters of God. So it's not hubristic, actually. It's just taking fully the responsibility that God has put on our shoulders to be made in the image and likeness, right? And to name the animals. And in that sense, I am myself very much concerned about the ecological crisis, and I think anthropocentrism, a certain kind of anthropocentrism, is a big part of that, um, of our ecological catastrophe right now. But on the other hand, we can't just shirk our responsibility and pretend like we're not going to have an influence over the future of this planet. We are, and actually, if we are going to avert disaster for ourselves and for many other species, it's because we're going to change the way in which we're going to exert a different kind of power that uplifts, the rest of the community of life. But we have to acknowledge that we're going to shape it one way or another, whether we destroy it or whether we enhance it. And I think we could enhance this planet. We could bring more richness and beauty to the living world. I mean, there are some aspects of the biosphere and of the way in which the kingdoms of nature are organized that I think could be improved upon. And I'm not a techno utopian, like let's gene edit and like do whatever we want. I think we need to bring in some other ways of knowing here, and not just the reductionistic sort of genetic mastery approach to trying to control nature. I don't think we can control nature, but we can certainly work with it respectfully, reciprocally, and continue this cosmic journey towards beauty. I think we have that capacity, but we need as much art as science, and we need spirituality. It's not just a scientific engineering problem, how we get lion to lay with lamb, uh,
No, wait,
figuratively and literally.
hmm. When I talked with JP Marceau from the Symbolic World recently, we discussed how all layers of reality, like humans, but also animals, are being raised up. Like we raise animals up by taking good care and like having good dominion over them. Not exploitative, but also like not abdicating that responsibility. But then also humans, like there are saints, there are people that exemplify being human, and then those saints judge us. And then also Christianity, there's the idea of resurrection, that you don't lose the physicality. You don't like go up to heaven and stay there or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But that things are being raised up, right? Like what is good is sort of like kept and raised up, and what is bad is removed. Do you think that can be consonant with Whitehead?
Mm. Yeah, I think instead of, in an evolutionary cosmology and evolutionary theology, rather than heaven and hell being it's a vertical dimension that like, oh, you go to heaven after you die, or you go to hell after you die, depending on what you do in this one life. The evolutionary view is more about heaven being in the future. Like we can make this world better and better. There's no other world to go to, but we can turn this one into heaven, or make it more heavenly at least, or we can make it more hellish. It's up to us. God creates the world through us, with us. We are God's hands. If God has a heart, it's our heart, and so it's a very participatory view of our whole situation, of the divine's relationship to the human, and both of our relationship to this cosmic process. Yeah, heaven's the future if we are worthy of it. And um,
Yeah, go on. Well, it's interesting, right? I was listening to John Vervaeke and Jonathan Pageau discuss related themes of what can we immanentize heaven and the glory to come, and it's like um it can't be forever kicked off into the infinite future. Like it's not going to happen because like there's resurrection. Like no, like the glorious world to come is going to come. It's not going to come. But then also you can't say it's too close, right? Because again, you don't want like a technological utopia. Hey, we can change genetics, we can modify this and that. Let's do it. It's like, wait a second, like, what are we modifying?
precautionary
What, yeah,
principle.
what,
Yeah.
and yeah, what? Who are we? What are we? what is this cosmos? And maybe that's also the role of metaphysics. Like before you start changing things and building a vision for the future, like first understand, what the world is, because in delving into metaphysics, having not too much of a background in it, it's very valuable and insightful, but also overwhelming at times. Like, actually, it's quite difficult to understand. Like, what am I looking at? Like, that's something I've talked with people in the symbolic world a lot as well about, is what is the intrinsic nature of things, right? Because you just assume, like, if you treat the entities that current science views as real, these are the entities. Like, these are electrons, these are atoms, this is a cell. Like, it's not that they're not real. There's a lot of good experiments pointed, but there's realness to them. But also, the intrinsic nature of things is not obvious, and
Yeah.
they're much deeper than what current models suppose.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, I'm a kind of structural realist, I guess, about science. But as a process relational metaphysician and philosopher, I think what's ultimately real are relations and not entities, or at least entities are nodes in a network of relations. But it's relations all the way down. And so, yeah, if we look at the history of science, it's very clear that the sorts of entities that science claims populates the universe are changing based on whatever the best experimental models are, and to the extent that those models are predictive and elucidating, I love to learn about them. I think the problems only happen when we think that the model could explain our experience, and that when we get into a situation where science thinks that it's in the business of conjecturing mathematical models, which are supposed to cause our experience, whatever empirically is measured, but that can't themselves ever be directly experienced, then I think we're in what Whitehead would call a bifurcated. Uh, we have a bifurcated philosophy of nature, right, where there's a conjectured cause hidden from experience, and then our experience, which is a kind of dream, projection, controlled hallucination, whatever. If we're in that sort of a situation, we've gone wrong somewhere. We need to swim back upstream and figure out how we ended up with an incoherent picture, with the conjecture of a mechanistic model causing the dream of our empirical experience. And I think that's how Whitehead ends up with a kind of um, pan experientialism. There's no bifurcation here. And that mathematical modeling can be a helpful heuristic, but we shouldn't imagine that we could get what's concrete out of what's abstract. It's not the abstract that explains the concrete. It's always the reverse, right? And so science natural science oversteps its boundaries when it starts to try to explain consciousness or experience. Science is just the study of what we are aware of in perception for Whitehead. Science presupposes that there is conscious perception, and we need metaphysics and philosophy really to explore how consciousness is related to the phenomena studied by science. We need science to study phenomena, find patterns and correlations in our perceptions of the world, both through our senses, but also through instruments that extend our senses. But, it's important to demarcate, I think, science and metaphysics. We don't want metaphysicians making scientific claims. We don't want scientists making metaphysical claims. Yeah.
What I find fascinating about relational process views like Whitehead's is that it's in a way weird, because you get like a pan experientialism, everything has experience, but it's also very simple and parsimonious, because you just kind of go like, don't cut off experience from things. Don't like assume like Kant or Descartes that things are already separated, and now you need to have like, just tie yourself in knots trying to like find how they connect matter and mind or whatever. It's just they're all already connected anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not indiscriminately spreading experience out everywhere. I think the materialist perspective is indiscriminately eliminating experience. We're all born animists, seems to me. Children are immersed in a living universe, quite obviously. And there's something naive about that needs to be matured. but we don't need to mature into the absurdity of being, lonely gypsies on a castaway, castaways on this remote island of life in a dead universe. I think there's something um, quite lifelike about the patterns of organization we see all around us on this planet and beyond, that it doesn't seem outlandish to me to adopt a mechanistic to adopt an organic vision rather than the mechanistic. It's the mechanistic vision that seems more anthropocentric to me, actually, or rather, it's the mechanistic vision that's more anthropomorphic, I should say, because human beings make machines. You don't find machines anywhere else in nature, and so we're taking this very human thing, the machine, and projecting it onto the whole universe. I think that's unwarranted.
Mm. When we talk about kind of pan experientialism and process philosophy, and then science and our own bodies and minds and how they all relate, it also makes me then want to think about memory and Bergson and how he
Mm.
thinks about we're not just connected to everything relationally, physically, but also throughout time. There's no uh, perhaps anything in the past that isn't still here in some way. But I wanted to ask you about that, and I'm sure you'll be more knowledgeable than me.
Yeah, well, I think the study of memory in neuroscience um, could still learn a lot from Bergson and William James, um, who would both really challenge as fundamentally mistaken this idea that we might find a material trace or a so-called engram. I mean, cognitive psychology, neuroscience has given up the search for some locally, a situated engram, like, and instead they look for sort of globally distributed kind of holographic engrams, and so it's more of a metaphorical use of that original term. But they're still looking for memory traces in the skull, uh, because that's just what follows from the materialist view of mind-brain relation. So where else could memory be, right? But from the Bergsonian perspective or Whitehead's perspective, um, memory doesn't need to be stored in some material trace because matter itself is nothing other than memory, right? Matter, what we call matter, what this all the hard, enduring objects around us, our own bodies, is a very habitual, monotonous process that is having to be reproduced moment by moment by moment, remembered, in other words. We're always in the present, but the present is constituted by two types of relations. So, relation to the past, which is internal, so that the past is fully present and just, non-locally distributed. It's sort of there. And, you know, Bergson and Whitehead would say that our bodies, our organism, our nervous system is a kind of antenna that can tune into this field of memory that's growing always, moment by moment. We don't need to store the memories in our bodies somewhere. That's not what the brain. That's not what the brain does. It's a tuning fork, right? Not a um, wax tablet that needs to have inscriptions carved into it. And I think this would free up, because it's a mistaken. Ultimately, it all comes down to a mistaken conception of time that's informing this materialistic science. And I think there are a lot of neuroscientists and cognitive scientists and biologists looking for engrams to explain memory as a material trace in the nervous system, who might not even think of themselves as materialists. But it's such common sense that we still adopt this model that I think is leading us up a blind alley. And so the Bergsonian take on memory is really important. There's a deep shift which occurs. We look at time very differently as a, I mean, the technical terminology would be to say time is an intensity. It's not something extensive, which is to say it's not measurable spatially. Bergson was very concerned about the false spatialization of time. And in post-relativistic physics, we want to bring space and time together, yes, but that's for the purposes of measurement. Um, I think Bergson and Whitehead's emphasis on time as a creative process that's new in each moment. And so you can't just have some general unit that would measure it numerically, because no two moments are the same. To measure something, you need to know that each unit is identical, you know, and you measure space, you make sure that the inches on the ruler are each the same length, that that ruler is not bending randomly. To measure time, you know, you need to have a consistent unit, but qualitatively speaking, in other words, in actual experience, no two moments of time are ever the same, right? And I think implicit in that is a totally different vision of memory, right? Um, yeah, so much more to say about that, but
Yeah, and to see if I understand it so far, it's like in our own bodies and our experience, and also objects around us, they they're they're made of and they come from a past, and I suppose the past doesn't just disappear, um like, and you can't just cut up time as like now is one moment, and then like I don't know 1 second, a second, a milliseconds, no, that's that, whatever, but however we want to do it, that's another moment. Like yeah Time is
mm-hmm.
a weird concept though. Like I was reading a book on Bergson and Einstein, the debates they had. They even talked with each other, and like the scientific versus the more like philosophical, intuitive view of time. And then even now, it's like not understood. And again, it's not a thing, right? It's a weird one. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, no, metaphysics, I think, really can begin most fruitfully by examining the nature of time, because that immediately gets you out of this situation where you think, oh, well, as physics advances, then we don't need metaphysics anymore. Like one replaces the other. And it's, no, I don't think that's how it works, actually. Um, in physics and in science, yeah, we want to bring more and more of experience under the regime of measurement, and we should push that as far as possible. But we have to remain clear on the fact that not everything can be measured. And in some sense, quantum theory and information theory in a different way, or in a similar way, are coming up, is science coming up against the edges of um, the of measurement practice, and the way in which, you know, you can't measure something without being able to see it. In other words, you need to be able to shine some photons on it. But is there at the quantum scale, when you shine photons on something, you're messing with what you were trying to measure, right? And so if ultimately we have to interfere with what it is that we wanted an objective measurement of, we can't really get an objective measurement of it. So this is the participatory aspect underlying science, which points you in a metaphysical direction right then and there, because all of a sudden, you know, as the early quantum theorists were discovering, like Bohr, the what we think nature is depends on the kind of questions we ask. You know, and he took that maybe in a more idealistic or Kantian transcendental direction, Niels Bohr, but Whitehead, Bergson, they go in a more realist direction with it. And those are the metaphysical options, right? But we have to do metaphysics. Just because science and physics continues to advance doesn't mean one day we're going to be done with metaphysics. Um, just for the simple reason that, you know, not everything can be reduced to a measurement and thrown into a model. What about the modeler? You know?
Mm, mm. When we think as well about Bergson and time not being something which is stored somewhere, like it's an object of and concrete like that, it makes me wonder about how we, because in modern cognitive science there's also an assumption not just that, yeah, we store memories maybe, but also that we're predicting the future. We're thinking about the future, but then I'm wondering like at what time scale, like how far into the future. And it comes back to memory. I feel like for me this is kind of a vague rambly question, but I'm just wondering if memory in the past never goes away. I'm wondering about what the memory of the future is like, and like the anticipatory nature of it, like we're talking about Whitehead, and how the world is creative, and like God also has like a part of himself that is sort of a lure that is pulling, he's in creation, he's pulling creation forward, and ordering creation.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering kind of whether there's a Bergsonian take to that, like What does our stance on the future look like, given that the future is also kind of open ended and like not separable from where we are now?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're related to the past in such a way that we have to conform to it to some degree, but we're also related to the future, which is open. For process philosophers like Bergson and Whitehead, the future doesn't exist yet, which uh, some people might think is obvious, but for some physicists who are enamored with the sort of block universe model, the future does already exist, and it's deterministic, and perception is just sort of this window pane moving through an already actualized uh, four-dimensional universe, and the entirety of the future is already sort of out there in some fourth dimension of space, or what we call time, but it's falsely spatialized time, right? But yeah, in a process cosmology, the future doesn't yet exist, but it as something actual. But it is a sort of, it has a kind of quasi existence as a field of possibilities, a network of possibilities. And those possibilities are ordered relative to our position um, in the present. Based on what's occurred in the past, there are certain things that are more likely to occur than other things. There are some possibilities that are all but close to us now because of what's happened in the past. And so, for Whitehead, we need to do some serious metaphysical heavy lifting to explain um, how it is that these possibilities available to us for realization in the present are ordered. And this is just a deep question around the, like, why should nature be intelligible to us in the first place? Um, we can find regularities in our observation of the past, and we assume that those regularities will continue into the future. It's the basis of induction, right? Science presupposes induction as a valid method of inference. Science itself cannot explain why induction works. You need philosophy for that. And Whitehead's trying to offer an explanation that begins with an account of statistics and what is the basis for assuming the endurance of certain regimes of order in particular environments, and how do we come up with statistical probabilities based on those assumptions. But the thing is, we would need, a probability for the ground that establishes the probability within that ground of something else occurring, and there's a kind of infinite regressive grounds that you need. And so ultimately Whitehead says, hey, this bottoms out in a divine source of probability that's not statistical. It's not a calculation, but rather has to do with what he calls the graduated intensive relevance of possibility. And what he means by that is the primordial nature of God orders possibility according to a sense of what has highest value. And this is the possibilities are infinite, and the role of the divine is to tilt that infinity towards beauty and goodness. And it's relative to that divine tilting toward beauty and goodness of a field of possibilities that each moment of our actual experience has access to relevant novelty, right? Um, if and so Whitehead thinks without that divine ordering of possibility, the moment by moment experience, even just cause and effect playing out, the collapse of the wave function through decoherence and all of this leading to a more or less ordered universe wouldn't make sense. It wouldn't be possible, nor would induction be possible for scientists, trying to make sense of how this all unfolds. So he's led to these theological ideas not because he has some emotional attachment to God to make it all okay in the end or whatever. It's actually initially for Whitehead an attempt to explain and justify science, and to justify the fact that we do experience a universe with a very high degree of organization and order. It's not perfectly ordered, but it does seem that this capacity to anticipate a future based on possibilities that are arrayed to one another, not only logically and consistently, but aesthetically, right? So that's how he tells that story.
Yeah, because I'm trying to imagine if there was a reality of all the possibilities, but no God. I guess like that's not really anything. It's not anything
Right.
actual.
Right.
And so you need a God there if there is anything. And like, also again our own experience, that if we were faced with all possible possibilities, that would be overwhelming. And so
Yep.
we're but then and so God orders what's there and helps us see what you might say what we should do, and like towards the aims his aims of aesthetic beauty, as you say. Do you think that modern like biologists say would try and explain that as that is what maybe our brain does, though, like there's loads of possibility, but we make sense of it, we evolved senses to make sense of it?
I just would say we also need to understand how it is that the evolutionary process could have generated brains in the first place. Whitehead says, you know, the problem of evolution is to explain how the more complex organisms come out of the simpler organisms when the more complex organisms are actually deficient in survival power. Bacteria are far more adapted to the earth environment. They're basically immortal. Why evolve beyond that? If it's merely about the struggle for existence, to reproduce effectively and dominate the landscape, bacteria accomplished that billions of years ago. Evolution has continued, and Whitehead thinks we need another explanation than just natural selection maximizing survivability to account for more complex life forms that, again, don't live very long, are fragile, uh, and experience far more pain. We're very sensitive. Human beings are not only sensitive to pain, but as we discussed earlier, to suffering and angst. Why? There's Whitehead thinks there's indication that evolution is driven by more than just mere survival, the desire to survive. There's also apparently a desire to thrive, to deepen experience. There are aesthetic drives in this evolutionary process as well. And even Darwin admits that with sexual selection. So there's room, I think, to expand and emphasize different aspects of Darwin's vision here. It's more the neo-Darwinians that are blind to the aesthetic possibilities in evolution, I think.
Is Whitehead's God one that can be or should be worshipped?
Can be. Whitehead says the power of God is the worship that God inspires, which is kind of, again, pointing out the ways that God needs us to be powerful. And so, you know, yeah, God, as Whitehead envisions this divine function, would be a potential object of worship and subject of worship. But it would be a kind of worship that wouldn't, I don't think, a process theology and a process based sort of Christianity or Buddhism, or I think you can be a process, you can have a process orientation in any of the major religions. It wouldn't be the form of worship that would project the divine beyond oneself, but would recognize how deeply participatory divine action is, and that if the divine is to be realized or taken seriously as a real ingredient in the world process, it's because we live up to that ideal ourselves. This isn't the sort of God that would come in and rescue us. Like, if anything, and I can speak as someone who's compelled by the Christian mythos, though I think it's also the history of Christianity and the deed of Jesus. The rescue mission already happened. It, you know, if if there's a second coming, it's going to be through us as a spiritual community of human beings. There's no God is now in the universe. God is part of the earth. God isn't somewhere else. There's no more rescue mission that's not going to be driven by us, right? It happened already.
Yeah, very interesting. This has been really fun, Matt. Thank you very much. And I always listen to your podcast and read your Substack, but then for this, I bought your book, Crossing the Threshold. Wanted to buy one of your books, and it was just it's really beautiful. So
Oh,
get that. I
thanks.
recommend that. Anyone else you want to point people?
I'm on Substack. Definitely enjoy writing and being in dialogue with folks. So reach out.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah. Thanks,
Thank you.
Jack.